The idea is the reason why the world is so disorderly is because you've got now with the Cold War gone, you've got all these ethnic groups killing each other and so on. Well, as usual, it's always a good idea to start by asking about the facts. Whenever you hear anything said very confidently, the first thing that should come to mind is, wait a minute, is that true?
My city is still breathing, but barely it's true. Through buildings gone missing like teeth, the sidewalks are watching me think about you. Sparkled with broken glass, I'm back with scars to show. Back with the streets I know will never take me anywhere but here. I know we meet here for our dress rehearsal to say I wanted it this way. Wait for the year to drown. Spring forward, fall back down. I'm trying not to wonder where you are.
Thanks. I just got back from Brazil, where they don't have any fire codes. And if you think this is uncomfortable, you should see a meeting there. People packed so tight that it was a good question whether the oxygen level would suffice. Fortunately, there wasn't a fire. There would have been a huge catastrophe. Well, the title, you noticed, had a question mark after it. And the reason for the question mark is that whatever's been happening for the past several months and is going on now, and however you evaluate it, like it, hate it, whatever, it's pretty clear that it cannot be a war on terror. And in fact, that's close to a logical necessity, at least if we accept certain pretty elementary assumptions, certain principles. So let me try to make those clear at the outset. The first principle guideline, if you like, is that we ought to, I will try, and I think we should, bend over backwards to give the benefit of the doubt to the United States government whenever it's possible. So if there's any dispute about how to interpret something, we'll assume they're right. The second guideline is that we should take rather seriously, very seriously, the pronouncements of leadership, especially when they're made with great sincerity and emotion. So, for example, when George Bush tells us that he's the most devout Christian since the apostles, we should believe him, take him at his word, and we should therefore conclude that he certainly has memorized over and over again in his Bible reading classes and in church the famous definition of hypocrite that's given in the Gospels. Namely, the hypocrite is the person who applies to others standards that he refuses to apply to himself. So if you're not a hypocrite, you assume that if something is right for us, it's right for them. And if it's wrong when they do it, it's wrong when we do it. That's really elementary. And I assume the president would agree, and all of his admirers as well. So those are the principles I'd like to start with. Well, just side comment, I mean, unless we can rise to that minimal level of moral integrity, we should at least stop talking about things like human rights and right and wrong and good and evil and all such highfalutin things, because all of our talk should be dismissed, in fact dismissed with complete repugnance, unless we can at least rise to that minimal level. I think that's obvious, and I'd hope there'd be agreement on that too. Well, with that much in place, just that much for background, let me formulate a thesis. The thesis is that we are all total hypocrites on any issue relating to terrorism. Now, let me clarify the notion we. I mean, by we, I mean people like us, people who have high degree of privilege, of training, resources, access to information, for whom it's pretty easy to find out the truth about things if we want to, if we decide that that's our vocation. And in the case in question, you really don't have to dig very deep. It's all right on the surface. So I mean, when I say we, I mean that category. And I definitely mean to include myself in we, because I've never proposed that our leaders be subjected to the kinds of punishment that I've recommended for enemies. So that's hypocrisy. In fact, if there are people who escape it, I really don't know them, haven't come across them. It's a very powerful culture. It's hard to escape its grasp. So that's thesis number one. We're all total hypocrites on the matter of, in the sense of the Gospels, on the matter of terrorism. The second thesis is stronger, namely that the first thesis is so obvious that it takes real effort to miss it. And in fact, I should go home right now because it is obvious. Nevertheless, let me continue and say why I think both theses are correct. Well, to begin with, what is terrorism? Got to say something about that. That's supposed to be a really tough question. Academic seminars and graduate philosophy programs and so on. Very vexing, complex question. However, in accordance with the guidelines that I mentioned, I think there's a simple answer. Namely, we just take the official U.S. definition of terrorism, since we're accepting the pronouncements of our leaders literally. So let's take their definition. In fact, that's what I've always done when I've been writing about terrorism for the last 20 years or so. Just accept the official definition. So, for example, a simple and important case is in a U.S. Army manual in 1984, which defines terrorism as the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature. Well, that seems simple, appropriate. Particularly good choice because of the timing, 1984. 1984, you'll recall, was the time when the Reagan administration was waging a war against terrorism, particularly what they called state-supported international terrorism, a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in the modern age. Happen to be quoting George Shultz, who was the administration moderate. Another guideline is we'll keep to the moderates, not the extremists. So that's 1984. Reagan had come into office a couple years earlier. His administration had immediately declared that the war against terrorism would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy, and they identified two regions as the source of this plague by depraved opponents of civilization itself, Central America and the Middle East. And there was quite wide agreement on that. So in 1985, for example, every year Associated Press has a poll of editors on the most important story of the year. And in 1985, the winner was Middle East terrorism. So they agreed. Right towards the end of that year, 1985, Shimon Peres, Israeli Prime Minister, came to Washington, and Reagan and Peres denounced the evil scourge of terrorism, referring to the Middle East. Scholarship and experts also agreed. There's a huge literature for the last 20 years on terrorism, particularly state-supported international terrorism. I don't have time to review it, but a good illustration, which I'll keep to, is the December 2001 issue of Current History, journal Current History, good, serious journal, It's called America at War. It includes leading historians, specialists, experts on terrorism. And they identified the 1980s as the era of state-supported, state-sponsored terror, agreeing with the Reagan administration. And I agree with that, too. I think it was the era of state-sponsored international terrorism. One leading author, Martha Crenshaw, says that in that era, the United States adopted a proactive stance to deter the plague. Mostly it's about the Middle East, but Central America is occasionally mentioned. For example, U.S. support from two authors, co-authors, from the Brookings Institution described the U.S. war against the U.S. Contra war against Nicaragua as a model for how to fight a war against terrorism. They say that that was a model for U.S. support for the Northern Alliance in the current phase of the war against terrorism. The seeds of contemporary terrorism, however, are much deeper. The major historian in the group points out, David Rapport, a leading academic specialist on terrorism, editor of the Journal of Terrorism, and so on. He points out that it goes back to the origins of modern terrorism, like Osama bin Laden, go back to the early 1960s, when, I'm quoting him now, when Viet Cong terror against the American Goliath kindled the hopes that the Western heartland was vulnerable. I won't comment on that, but I'd like you to, just as an exercise, you might try to find a historical analog to that statement somewhere. I'll just leave it at that. The world also, and it's easy, without commenting, if you check through the scholarly literature, you'll find the same story all the time, virtually exceptionless. The world agreed with the Reaganites, too. In 1985, right after Reagan and Paris had denounced the evil scourge of terrorism, the General Assembly passed a resolution condemning terrorism. And in 1987, it passed a much stronger resolution and a much more explicit one denouncing terrorism in all its forms and calling on all states to do everything they can to fight against the plague and everything you like. It's true that that wasn't unanimous. There was one abstention, namely Honduras, and 2 votes against, the usual 2. They gave their reasons for voting against the major UN resolution on international terrorism. Namely, both states, the United States and Israel, pointed to the same paragraph as the reason for their negative votes. It was a paragraph that said that nothing in the present resolution could in any way prejudice the right to self-determination, freedom, and independence as derived from the United Nations Charter of people forcibly deprived of that right, particularly peoples under colonial and racist regimes and foreign occupation, or could deprive them of the right to obtain support for others in these ends in accord with the Charter of the United Nations. That was the offending paragraph. And it's easy to understand why. It raised a serious problem for the United States and Israel. The African National Congress was identified officially as a terrorist organization in the United States, and South Africa was officially an ally. But the phrase struggle against colonial and racist regimes plainly referred to the struggle of the ANC against the apartheid regime, so that's unacceptable. The phrase foreign occupation, everyone understood, referred to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, then in its 20th year, extremely harsh and brutal from the beginning, continuing only because of decisive U.S. Military, economic, and diplomatic support, which runs up to the present. So obviously that was unacceptable. So therefore, the vote was 153 to 2 with 1 abstention. So it wasn't totally unanimous. It wasn't reported, and it's disappeared from history. You can check to find out. Incidentally, that's standard practice. When the master says something is wrong, it's down the memory hole. You know, doesn't get reported, and it's forgotten. But it's there. You know, if you want to look, you can discover it. I'll give you the sources if you like. Reagan at that time he and Paris were talking about the evil scourge of terrorism in the Middle East. George Shultz didn't entirely agree. He thought that what he called the most alarming manifestation of state-sponsored terrorism was frighteningly close to home. Namely, it was a cancer in our landmass, a cancer right nearby that was threatening to conquer the hemisphere with a revolution without borders. Rather interesting propaganda fabrication, revealed to be a fraud instantly, but always used repeatedly afterwards, even by the same journals who explained why it was total fabrication. It was just too useful to abandon. And there's also an interesting, if you think about it, the fabrication had a certain element of truth in it, an important element of truth. Could come back to that if you like. Anyhow, this cancer in our landmass was threatening to conquer everything, openly following Hitler's Mein Kampf, and we plainly had to do something about that. It was a serious. There's a day in the United States called Law Day. Elsewhere in the world, it's called May Day, May 1st, a day for support of the struggles of American workers for an 8-hour day. But in the United States, it's a jingoist holiday called Law Day. And on Law Day 1985, President Reagan declared a national emergency because the government of Nicaragua constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. That was renewed annually. George Shultz informed Congress that we must cut the Nicaraguan cancer out, and not by gentle means. Things are too serious for that. So to quote Shultz, recall the administration moderate, the good cop. Quote Shultz, he said, "Negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table." He condemned those who advocate utopian legalistic means like outside mediation, the United Nations, the World Court, while ignoring the power element of the equation. I'll avoid quoting the hardliners. At that time, the United States was exercising the power element of the equation with mercenary forces based in Honduras, attacking Nicaragua. They were under the supervision of John Negroponte, who was just appointed to run the diplomatic side of the diplomatic component of the current war on terror as a UN ambassador. The military component of the current war on terror is Donald Rumsfeld, who at that time was Ronald Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East, the other place where the plague was raging through 1985, in fact. The United States at that time was also blocking utopian legalistic means that were being pursued by the World Court, the Latin American countries, and others, and it continued to block those means right to the end until the final victory of its terrorist wars throughout Central America. Well, how was the war against state-sponsored terrorism waged in those two regions by the people who, in fact, are leading the new phase? So it's pretty close historical continuity, not just those two, of course. Well, let's just, to illustrate, pick the peak year, the worst year, 1985 in the Middle East, top story of the year. So what were the, who wins the prize for the worst acts of terrorism in the Middle East in 1985? Well, I know of three candidates. Maybe you can suggest a different one. One candidate is a car bombing in Beirut in 1985. The car bombing was placed outside a mosque. The bomb was timed to go off when people were leaving to make sure you kill the maximum number of people. It, according to the Washington Post, killed 80 people, wounded over 250, mostly women and girls leaving the mosque, but it was a huge explosion, so it blew up the whole street, killed babies and beds and so on and so forth. The bomb was aimed at a Muslim sheikh who escaped. It was set off by the CIA in collaboration with British intelligence and Saudi intelligence, and specifically authorized by William Casey, according to Bob Woodward's History of Casey and the CIA. So that's a clear-cut example of international terrorism, very unambiguous, and I think it's one of the candidates for the prize for the peak year of 1985. Another candidate surely would be the so-called Iron Fist operations that Shimon Peres's government was carrying out in occupied southern Lebanon in March of 1985. The operations, this is southern Lebanon, which was under military occupation in violation of a Security Council order to leave, but with U.S. authorization, so this is irrelevant. The bombing, the Iron Fist operations were targeting what the High Command called terrorist villagers in southern Lebanon. Included many massacres, lots of atrocities, kidnapping of people for interrogation and taking them to Israel and so on. It reached new depths of calculated brutality and arbitrary murder, according to a Western diplomat familiar with the region who was observing. There was no pretense of self-defense. Rather, it was openly undertaken for political ends. It was conceded, it wasn't even argued. So that's a clear case of international terrorism, although here we might say that it's aggression. I'll call it just international terrorism, in line with the principle that we bend over backwards to give the United States the benefit of the doubt. Of course, this is a U.S. operation. Israel does it because they're given arms and aid and diplomatic support by the United States. So we'll decide to call this just international terrorism, not the much more serious war crime of aggression. The same, incidentally, was true of the much worse operations of 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, killed maybe 20,000 or so people. Again, crucial U.S. military and economic and diplomatic support. The U.S. had to veto a couple of Security Council resolutions to keep the slaughter going, provided the arms for it, and so on. So it's a U.S.-Israeli invasion, if we're honest. The goal of the invasion, I'll just quote the New York Times on that, the goal was to install a friendly regime in Lebanon and oust the PLO, which would help persuade Palestinians to accept Israeli rule in the West Bank and Gaza. That's actually accurate, and I have to compliment the New York Times in saying that. That was this January 24th. As far as I know, that's the first time in mainstream U.S. literature that anyone has dared to say what was absolutely common knowledge in Israel and in the dissident literature 20 years ago. I mean, I was writing this in 1983, just using Israeli sources. But it couldn't penetrate U.S. commentary. You might check and see. As far as I know, this is the first breakthrough. I'm not sure the reporter understood what he was saying. But anyway, he did say it. James Bennett, January 24th. Well, prize for James Bennett for telling the truth after 20 years. And it's true. And, of course, it's a textbook illustration, virtually textbook illustration of international terrorism. This time we have to bend over backwards pretty far to call it international terrorism because it's hard to say why this isn't overt aggression, the kind of action for which U.S. and Israeli leaders should be subjected to Nuremberg trials, real serious war crime. But again, let's keep to the guidelines and say it's only international terrorism. Well, that's the second example. This 85, I'll keep to the Iron Fist operations. Third, the only other example for 1985 that I know of took place a few days before Shimon Peres arrived in Washington to join Reagan in denouncing the evil scourge of terrorism. Shortly before that, Peres sent the Israeli Air Force to bomb Tunis, killing 75 people, civilians, torn to shreds with smart bombs. It was all rather accurately and graphically depicted by a highly respected Israeli reporter, Amnon Kapeliuk, in the Hebrew press in Israel, and corroborated by other sources. So the United States cooperated with that by withdrawing the Sixth Fleet so they didn't have to inform their ally Tunisia that the bombers were on their way, presumably getting refueled on the way. So that's a third candidate. I don't know of any other candidates that even come close to being candidates for. Incidentally, George Shultz, the moderate, immediately after the bombing, he telephoned the Israeli foreign minister to say that the United States had considerable sympathy for this operation, but he backed away from open support for massive international terrorism or maybe aggression when the Security Council unanimously condemned the attack as an act of armed aggression, the United States abstaining. Didn't want to vote against that. So those are the three cases top three cases that win the prize for 1985, to my knowledge. And again, I'll assume that these are just international terrorism, so we're not calling for a Nuremberg trial. Just more international terrorism by depraved opponents of civilization itself, and examples which are pretty hard to miss, remember, because this was the peak story of the year. International terrorism in the Middle East. Here's three perfect examples. In fact, the only three major examples that I know of. However, they aren't candidates. In fact, they're not even in the running. They're not competitors. The examples that are in the running are, for example, cited in the current history issue to which I referred, which does discuss 1985 and gives two examples of the evil scourge of terrorism, namely the hijacking of TWA 897, killing one American Navy diver, and the hijacking of the Achille Lauro, the boat, which led to the killing of Leon Klinghoffer, a crippled American, both surely terrorist atrocities. Those are the two examples that are in the running that are memorable, that count for international terrorism. Well, the